Every year, humanity produces hundreds of millions of tons of plastic. From the packaging that wraps our food to the devices in our hands, plastic has become so embedded in daily life that it often fades into the background. Yet when you pull back and look at the scale, from aerial views of landfills stretching to the horizon, to ocean currents carrying floating debris across entire continents, the reality becomes harder to ignore. According to widely cited environmental reports, only a small fraction of all this plastic, often estimated at under 10% globally, actually gets recycled. The rest follows a far less visible path. It accumulates, disperses, breaks apart, and in many cases, simply disappears from sight without ever truly going away. Because the real story behind plastic pollution isn't just about litter scattered across beaches or bottles tossed into bins. It's about a system that, from its very beginning, was never designed to solve the problem it created. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to a time when plastic wasn't a problem at all, it was a promise. In the mid-20th century, plastic was marketed as a revolutionary material. Lightweight, durable, cheap to produce, and endlessly adaptable. It quickly replaced traditional materials like glass, metal, and paper in countless industries. Archival footage from the 1950s shows cheerful families embracing disposable packaging as a symbol of modern convenience. Supermarkets transformed into temples of abundance, where everything came wrapped, sealed, and preserved. Factories scaled production at unprecedented rates, feeding a growing global demand. By the early 2000s, plastic production had surged into the hundreds of millions of tons annually, driven by population growth, urbanization, and consumer culture. But with that explosion came a cost that wasn't immediately visible. The question isn't simply why plastic pollution exists. It's why, after decades of awareness campaigns, environmental warnings, and global initiatives, it continues to accelerate. Recycling programs have been promoted for over 40 years. Blue bins have become a universal symbol of responsibility. And yet landfills continue to expand, oceans continue to fill, and even the most remote ecosystems, places once considered untouched, now show traces of plastic waste. That contradiction points to something deeper than individual behavior. It points to a structural issue. The first overlooked mechanism lies in the very idea of recycling itself. For decades, it has been presented as a solution, a closed loop where used materials are transformed into new products, reducing waste and conserving resources. But in practice, plastic recycling has always faced significant limitations. Unlike materials such as aluminum or glass, which can be recycled efficiently and repeatedly, plastics come in a wide variety of chemical compositions. Each type requires different processing methods, and mixing them can render entire batches unusable. Add to that the issue of contamination, food residue, labels, adhesives, and the process becomes even more complex. Investigations and environmental reports, particularly in the late 2010s, revealed that a large percentage of plastic labeled as recyclable was never actually processed. In many cases, it was simply too expensive to handle. For years, much of this waste was exported to developing countries, where lower labor costs made sorting and processing more feasible. But when China, one of the largest importers of plastic waste, imposed restrictions around 2018, the global system was thrown into disarray. Suddenly, countries that had relied on exporting their waste were forced to confront the reality that their recycling infrastructure was incomplete. Facilities became overwhelmed, stockpiles grew, and a significant portion of plastic that consumers believed was being recycled ended up in landfills or incinerators instead. The familiar recycling symbol, stamped onto countless products, added another layer to this illusion. To most people, it signaled environmental responsibility. But in reality, it often indicated nothing more than the type of plastic used, not whether it would actually be recycled. That distinction, subtle but critical, created a powerful misconception. It suggested that the problem could be solved at the point of disposal, when in fact it had already been determined at the point of production. This leads to a more uncomfortable realization. Historical evidence suggests that the widespread promotion of recycling wasn't purely a grassroots environmental movement. In the late 20th century, as concerns about waste began to grow, industries involved in plastic production supported campaigns that emphasized individual responsibility. Advertisements encouraged people to sort their trash, clean their containers, and do their part to protect the environment. On the surface, the message was positive and empowering, but critics argue that it also served another purpose, shifting the focus away from the scale of production itself. Because while consumers were being told to recycle, the volume of plastic being produced continued to rise, doubling over the decades. From an economic perspective, the logic was straightforward. Producing new plastic from raw materials was often cheaper than collecting, sorting, and processing used plastic. Oil and gas, the primary feedstocks for plastic, remained relatively inexpensive. Recycling, by contrast, required infrastructure, labor, and energy. The result was a system that, despite its appearance, was fundamentally unbalanced. Plastic was designed for convenience and disposability, while recycling was expected to manage the consequences. The loop became self-reinforcing. Produce more plastic, encourage recycling to manage the waste, then continue producing even more. The assumption was that recycling would eventually catch up. But the evidence suggests it never did. And perhaps more importantly, it was never intended to. By this point, the visible impact of plastic pollution is already staggering. Images of polluted beaches, marine animals entangled in debris, and floating garbage patches have become emblematic of the crisis. But these images only capture part of the story. Because the most significant effects of plastic pollution are no longer visible to the naked eye. As plastic breaks down over time, it doesn't simply disappear. It fragments into smaller and smaller pieces, eventually becoming microplastics, tiny particles that can measure less than 5 millimeters in size. These particles are now being detected almost everywhere scientists look. In the depths of the ocean, in agricultural soil, in the air we breathe, and in the water we drink. Peer-reviewed studies have reported the presence of microplastics in seafood, salt, and even bottled water. More recently, research has suggested that these particles have been found in human blood and tissues, raising new questions about long-term health effects. While the full implications are still being studied, the trajectory is clear. Plastic pollution is no longer confined to waste management or environmental conservation. It has entered biological systems, moving through food chains and ecosystems in ways that were never anticipated when plastic was first introduced. A single plastic bottle, discarded today, doesn't vanish. It undergoes a slow transformation, breaking apart under sunlight, friction, and environmental exposure. Over time, it becomes part of a global cycle, circulating through air currents, waterways, and living organisms. The hidden cost of plastic isn't just its volume, it's its persistence. It doesn't degrade in the way natural materials do. It accumulates, adapts, and endures. At this stage, the pattern begins to emerge more clearly. Plastic pollution isn't the result of a single failure. It's the outcome of three interconnected forces. First, a production system that prioritizes volume and efficiency, generating vast quantities of plastic at low cost. Second, a waste management system that struggles to keep up, constrained by technical, economic, and logistical limitations. And third, the inherent durability of plastic itself, which ensures that once it enters the environment, it remains there for decades, if not centuries. Together, these forces create a widening gap between what is produced and what can realistically be managed. That gap is where pollution accumulates. And while the scale of the problem can feel overwhelming, there are signs of change. Some governments have begun to implement bans on single-use plastics, targeting items like bags, straws, and cutlery. Others are exploring policies known as extended producer responsibility, which shift the cost of waste management back to the companies that produce the materials. This approach aims to create economic incentives for reducing waste at the source, encouraging the development of more sustainable designs. At the same time, researchers and innovators are working on alternative materials, from biodegradable plastics to reusable packaging systems that reduce the need for disposables altogether. These efforts represent important steps forward. But many experts caution that they may not be enough on their own. Without addressing the overall scale of production, these solutions risk becoming incremental improvements rather than transformative changes. They may slow the growth of plastic pollution, but not reverse it. And that brings the story back to where it began. The next time you see a recycling bin, it's worth pausing for a moment. Not to question the value of recycling, it still plays an important role, but to consider the larger system it exists within. Because the real question isn't just how we dispose of plastic. It's how much we produce in the first place, and why. Is the burden of solving this crisis something that can realistically be placed on individual choices alone? Or does it require a fundamental shift in how materials are designed, manufactured, and regulated at a global scale? The answer may not be simple, but it's becoming increasingly clear that the current approach has limits. plastic pollution is not just an environmental issue. It's a reflection of economic priorities, industrial practices, and collective assumptions about convenience and consumption. And changing it may require more than better habits. It may require rethinking the entire system from the ground up. So the question remains one that continues to shape policy debates, corporate strategies, and everyday decisions around the world. Do you believe individual action can truly solve plastic pollution? Or does the responsibility lie primarily with industries and policymakers? Thanks for watching. Subscribe Global Exposes now for more exposes.